So, Bruchim Habayim, welcome once again to a cup of Kabbalah. And here I have my cup. Now, just to continue pondering the spirituality of a cup, I might ask the question, does my cup overflow? That's a famous line from Psalm 23, my cup overflows. And we talked earlier about Malay, about the fullness of existence and the desire to be full. And so we want a full cup in our life. However, circumstances can be different. And sometimes you need to ask the opposite question. Maybe what you need to ask yourself is not, is this cup adequately full? But rather, what's the size of my cup? Maybe I have unrealistic expectations for the world, and therefore I need to shrink my cup to the point where it is once again overflowing with fullness. Just a thought. All right, so we are on session 4 of Cup of Kabbalah, and up to this point, I've really been giving us the tools for what's really coming. All right. So we've talked about letters and numbers and their supernal significance. We've also talked about imagery, particularly the tree of life, as as the Germans would say, a leitmotif, a leading symbol of Jewish mysticism, the idea of life itself being the presence of God, dare I say, the embodiment of God in the world. We, of course, don't believe in an incarnation, but we might arguably believe that life itself is God's presence, and the Word of God is God's presence. So maybe it's not so much an incarnation of God in our lives, but an inscription of God in our lives, or a DNA of God in our lives. In any case, we are coming now to the most important contribution, the enduring contribution of Kabbalah to the development of mystical doctrines, one that has overflowed and gone far past Jewish tradition. And this is this remarkable diagram, this idea to graph out God, or at least God's presence in the world, in a visual kind of way. It's called the Sefirot. The Sefirot represent, not surprisingly, 10, remember. The 32 paths of wisdom consist of the 22 letters of the alphabet and their combinations, and the decimal system of numbers. So 10 Sefirot represent divine qualities, emanations, qualities, attributes of God, which serve as the substrate of all we experience in the world. The word Sephira, which means globe, first appears in Sefer Yetzirah, and there it probably has a more numerical meaning. Now, however, as we go further into Kabbalah, it becomes Sphero, more rounded in its concept, and it gets expressed. Now, realize that in Greek thought, and there's a lot of Greek thought coming into this conversation, the sphere is the perfect shape. And therefore, a sphere is the embodiment or the representational symbol of God, because it's the most perfect, and God is the most perfect. All right, so we got our 22 letters, we got our 10 numbers, and as it goes forward, the Sphirot take on a ever more important basis for understanding Jewish mysticism, On that aspect of mysticism that isn't necessarily the active pursuit of encounter with God, but rather a more speculative sense of understanding metaphysics. Physics, of course, is why does an object go into motion? Why does an object stop? Et cetera, things like that. Metaphysics is trying to understand the mechanics of God, the how the divine order works, and the Sphirot become a major element of this, and it becomes a richer notion of a multifaceted and dynamic representation of divine wisdom. Um, and it turns out that this symbol is so powerful, it's incredibly fluid and it's open ended. And I'm sure part of this is that different authors take different things from the meaning of the Sefirot, but it becomes an incredibly powerful metaphysical model. And it cannot be emphasized enough that different discrete teachings within Kabbalah, the work of different authors, will put different emphasis on this idea of the Sefirot. They will draw different lessons from it. They will try and teach you different ideas. But remarkably, this object, this illustration, this mental picture is flexible enough to be able to embrace all of these possibilities. Sometimes you may encounter a teaching about the Sphero that seems to be, at least apparently, contradictory to other teachings you've encountered of the Sphirot. And what will happen is, if that happens, a later author or later thinker will come along and figure out the convergence of these two contradictions. They will reconcile these models and bring them together. And so look at already, before we even get to actual Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism in the ancient world has talked about many entities, angels, divine palaces, the tree of life. All these different models have been offered up as a way to explain God's nature and God's interactions with the world. The Sefirot is able to condense all of these ideas together, which is one of its remarkable features. So, and the result of all of this is that this process of integration, this process of condensation, yields an incredibly rich vocabulary of symbols associated with divine force and power in the world. So let's start off with talking about where this idea comes from. Greek philosophy, Greek thought is not alien to Jewish tradition since antiquity. Jews, for example, in antiquity believed the world consisted of 7 layers, 7 spheres, 7 heavens, the number 7, significant. It's also based on the direct observation of those objects, celestial objects that you can see with the naked eye. So we're talking about the sun, the moon, and 5 planets that are visible just by direct observation. The telescope hasn't been invented yet. So this idea that there are 7 nesting spheres that mark the universe is part of the whole vision. All right. But here again, now another idea is integrated, and this is Platonism, the philosophy of Plato, and Neoplatonism, which comes along a couple of hundred years later, which is the work of a Egyptian philosopher named Plotinus. Plotinus is building upon Plato's system. And here's the essence of it. God is in some sense perfect. Maybe he's a sphere, as some Greek philosophers propose. Maybe he sits impassively. unaffected by outside forces, because any shift from uh, perfection, any change would lead to imperfection. So God is perfect. And yet God, according to Jewish tradition, has yielded this imperfect world. How is that possible? How is it possible for a perfect God to produce an imperfect product? And the answer, Plato and Plotinus argue, is emanations. Let me explain. So if I were to use a metaphor, if you were to imagine God as the sun, right, a perfect sun, without any flaw in it whatsoever. Not true of a physical sun or a physical star, but we won't get into that. We have this perfect entity, but this entity wants to extend itself out beyond itself. And therefore, what it does is it emanates. It sends forth rays. It projects itself out into the void. And the result of this is that a material world gradually emerges from this. Now, just as we all understand that the further the energy of the sun gets away from its core, the more diffused it becomes, so it is that Plato and Plotinus in their various models understood that as divine energy came forth from its perfect center, it became more diffuse. And as it becomes more diffuse, it becomes altered by its interaction with the larger void. And as a result, what you get is our world, the material world. God is pure spirit, but we are a combination of spirit and material. And that is the emanation force. All right. Now, is there a way to graph or map or calculate the nature of this emanation and its gradual development? I'm not even going to use the word devolution or decline, or its diffusion into the reality we know. Are you sticking with me here? Okay. So, based on Sefer Yetzirah, then following in Sefer HaBahir, technically the first work of Kabbalah, and then into the great masterpiece of Kabbalistic writing, the Zohar, we have this model of the Sefirot. And here it comes, your first picture. All right. This is the Sphero. You've seen this image. You understand what it represents. No, you understand what it looks like. You don't understand what it represents. So let me walk you through it, okay? So the idea is that there are 10 Sphirot. Remember, they're supposed to be spheres, so we have these graphic circles going on here. And God, the perfect God, which gradually be designated by a new title, Ein Sof, without end, the divine reality that God has no boundaries or dimensions or anything like that, or anything that we can define, decides to project out into the world. And this emanation consists of 10 components. And the first up here is Keter, all right? And this is the equivalent of divine thought, the impulse to create. I used the Aleph earlier, right, as a symbol of the divine mind. This is the Aleph zone. Keter means crown. And then two more entities emerge from that, all right? We have Chokhmah. Chokhmah is the idea of wisdom. Remember in the Bible, it talks about God created the world with wisdom. There it is. That is the divine attribute of wisdom. And then connected to that is the divine attribute. I think I'm doing this in reverse on the thing. Yeah, okay, so now I'm looking at it and I can see. So there's Chokhmah. And over here is the divine attribute of Bina, intelligence, insight. So we recognize that there is a distinction between being smart and being wise. And so there they are, those two divine attributes. God's pretty smart, but God is also wise. And these two then yield two more attributes of divinity, which are revealed a little farther as they emanate out. One of them is Gevura, that is God's justice, strength, power. The world is animated with powerful life energy, but it also represents rules and laws and systems. We understand, through the ideas of biology, physics, chemistry, we understand that the universe is governed by rules. And yet there is also here on the opposite side an equally important divine attribute, chesed, which could be translated as love or kindness or graciousness, that the material world is not enough into itself. The rules are not adequate to accommodate all circumstances. And so we need a little forgiveness, a little acceptance, a little tolerance, etc., etc. And then these two attributes come together and yield an even more important attribute to Ferret, that is beauty. This is the nexus of our emerging material world. The world is beautiful. The world is splendiferous. The world is glorious, but it is a combination of rules and love. You need both in order for the world to be as beautiful as it is. And then, as we get closer to the material world, you see these two other emerging ideas. One is Netzach, which means triumph or victory or goal setting. God has a purpose. Chod, which is another term for glory or supernal awesomeness, and these will represent the sources of revelation that are available to us. Even though God is way up this chain of being, the fact of the matter is we still have access to God through the ability for us to look back up and in some cases journey back up this system. And then we get to Yesod, and this is the foundation, and this is really where the material world starts to emerge. This is where we see the purity of spiritualism starts to fade away in favor of a more material and therefore impermanent existence. And then down here at the bottom is Malchut, or sometimes called Shekhinah. This is us. This is where we're at. So, understand the paradox of this system. First of all, we human beings, where we are the most removed from the divine source. Angels, palaces, other spiritual possibilities exist above us. We are remote. This is basically the zoom by which we may know the divine, but it's far away. It's not person to person. On the other hand, we are the culmination of creation. So there's the paradox. We are but dust and ashes, and yet God has created everything for our sake. That's a basic introduction to the Sefirot, a model for how to think about our relationship to God and the world. Now, there are other things going on here that you should notice, like, for example, all of these interconnecting symbolic channels, the roots between Sefirot that apparently are pathways I'm using that word pathway advisedly because you'll notice that each and every pathway has its own letter of the alphabet. So that means there are 22 pathways here. And along with the 22 pathways, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 numbers, 10 Sefirot. So there are the 32 paths of wisdom drawn out for you. It's a mandala, it's a labyrinth, it's a parable in visual form of how the world is structured from beginning to end spiritually. That's the Sphero. Now, it's not the only illustration that can be found. This, again, I said this idea, this metaphor, this image of the Sphero, this way of thinking about how God has ordered the universe is immensely flexible. And so you can envision it in other ways. So here is an example from my book Sefer HaBahir that shows the letter of each one of the Sefirot names nested one into the other, becoming basically a labyrinth, right? So up here is Keter. This is God surrounds all of this, and then God projects down into the material world in Keter. And each one of the first letters of each one of the Sefirot until we get to Malchut here at the very center. That's us. And it's a reverse labyrinth. If we want to be closer to God, we have to learn how to live in a way that takes us out to a broader place. If I were to borrow the biblical metaphor, we were once slaves in the land of Egypt, and now we are free. The word Mitzrayim, the word for Egypt, means the narrow place. So we start in a narrow place, and we gradually learn through enlightenment, through study, through Torah, to broaden our world, to understand the world in greater depth. So another lovely metaphor. And then there's this interesting metaphor that perceives everything in layers. This is a relatively late image of the Sefirot. You can see, I know most of you can't read, but if you can, it says Ein Sof. So all of the black area surrounding this image is the ultimate. God fills far more than the universe. But then it ends up that these 10 Sefirot represent layers, like an ogre, or an onion, or a parfait. But in any case, again, there we are in our reality in the center, but God is feeding. There's a little line right there. God is feeding divine energy to us, even though God is far bigger, far more remote, and far more overwhelming than anything we can imagine in our universe. And then finally, this interesting image, right? The Sefirot, which are really a tree, right? If you imagine them as a stylized tree, this is the most abstracted idea of the tree of life. But there it is. It's all of its essence is inside of us because it maps out to the human body, right? And as a result, we, in a certain sense, in a microcosm, are the tree of life. We embody the Sefirot in ourselves. And so our physicality is itself a pathway to God. All right. So I hope that's given you an impression of the powerful metaphor that is the Sefirot. Now, it's also the case, go back. You'll see here and actually with all of the Sefirot, that they have multiple names. Sometimes it's greatness, grace, or the right arm, or the blessed one, holy be he, or compassion, beauty, harmony. All of these different values, all of these different ideas, all of these different angels can be attached to specific Sefirot. And probably the most important one we need to be aware of is Malchut, which is the kingdom, the material world, is also Shekhinah. That is the indwelling presence of God, God within ourselves. The reason that we can be a microcosm of everything God's trying to do is that God is present in us, and that's the feminine aspect of God's Shekhinah. All right, that's a lot of data to throw at you, and I hope you can process it. You're welcome to watch this several times over. But the understanding is that these forces are the world sustaining process at all times. They're always there. It's happening to us now. It's happening to us in the past. It's happening in the future. It is dynamic. God may not change, but God's influence in the world is constantly in motion. So it's actually an interesting philosophical strategy to have a perfect God, but also to have a dynamic God at the same time. So it's really a remarkable way of doing things. It integrates all previous metaphysical symbols and models. It allows for many more interpretations, and that makes it not only incredibly ancient, it is including ideas that go all the way back to the book of Ezekiel, to the book of Genesis, but it also incorporates ways of thinking about the world now. And we can add a layer of contemporary thought, whether it be evolution or phenomenology or any of the modern disciplines we use, can be applied to the Sefirot and can produce a useful illustration of what our lives are like. So now I've plunged you right into Kabbalah in its full Malay, in its fullness, and I will continue to show you further layers of this ogre, this onion, this parfait, as we unfold reality. We start with the material world, which is, from this perspective, the least real. It's still real, but it's not close to the ultimate possibilities. That's at the top of the chain. But I've got to stop. All right, everyone. Thank you for coming to Cup of Kabbalah, and we'll talk again later.